afternoon, and welcome to this Friday edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Medeles, and I am your host here in Deep South Texas, Harlingen, Texas, to be exact, in the Rio Grande Valley. And joining me today is Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent, and our guest today is Ev Mead, Director of Proceso, Pacifico. Thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Thank you very much. Rudy.
So, Salvador, I'll let you get started.
Of course. Well, I'm glad that Ev was able to join us. He's a very busy man. He works on both sides of the border. He is the director of Proceso Pacifico. And rather than me trying to explain all the wonderful things that his organization does, I'll let Ev explain what Proceso Pacifico is all about.
Oh, thanks a lot, Sal. I appreciate the invitation. Proceso Pacifico is a small nonprofit organization, and we work in some of the areas most affected by the drug war, including Colombia and in Mexico, places like Sinaloa. We worked in Sinaloa actually for about 10 years. And what we do is offer educational and training programs to local leaders to help them learn where violence comes from, how violence prevention works, show them some best practices, help them organize civil society coalitions to work on violence prevention, things that can cross ideological and political lines. And one of our key methodologies, in addition to teaching, is we host local truth commissions where we invite people to come in a non-judicial setting where they can stay anonymous if they want and to share their stories and to try to find solidarity with other people who are living through, episodes of extreme violence and trying to figure out, how they can build and prosper and get beyond it.
Now, one of the people you are very familiar with, and a lot of people in Culiacan are as well, is Ovidio Guzman, one of the Chapitos, one of the four sons of Joaquin Chapo Guzman. He was arrested about 2.5 years ago. And up until that point, the Drug Enforcement Agency labeled him as the primary or the biggest exporter of fentanyl into the United States. Now, since his arrest, he's been extradited to the U.S., and is in the process, as we speak, of negotiating a deal with the U.S. government. Talk a little bit about this deal and what it's all about and what it might mean in Culiacan.
Yeah, so anytime you have one of these real high-profile extraditions, and there have been a whole bunch of them, to the credit of Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, she has extradited like 30 of the most powerful drug kingpins in Mexico, the United States, where they're facing charges. So in all of these cases, and there's a long history of this, including El Chapo's case, there's always this hope that in their negotiations with the government, they're going to kind of peel back the layers of the onion, and they're going to reveal, everyone in the world of organized crime and in the world of politics who's somehow involved. It's kind of like the Epstein case, we're all expecting the big bombshell. And it could happen. It could be that they reveal some high-level corruption that's embarrassing to the current government or to the previous government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. But we have to, I think, moderate our expectations a little bit, because the fact is that didn't happen much in the Chapo case. It didn't happen with several of his security directors who, also took plea deals or flipped or provided evidence. It didn't happen with the Ariano Felix cartel when they were arrested in Tijuana. There's a long history of this. So I think we have to moderate our expectations a little bit. But that is a little bit of what's on the table. It's, what is he going to reveal and exactly what is he going to get in exchange for this information? And it could be as simple as, when they charge him with he agrees to all the drug trafficking charges, and they give him a lengthy sentence, but he's not facing the death penalty. He's not facing the death penalty because they don't add the worst conspiracy charges, and they don't add charges that are related to violence. For example, if you compare his case with that of Rafael Caro Quintero, the U.S. is seeking the death penalty in that case for the assassination of a DEA agent, Kiki Camarena, in 1985. And for conspiring to kill other protected witnesses and police officers and others. So, there's some, just in the very narrow part, not in the big revelations in Mexican politics or something like that, but just in the narrow part of what is his criminal responsibility? He has a lot to gain by signing a plea deal. Just protecting his own life and protecting his own family might be enough.
Sure, we heard about the 17 family members who are basically given asylum, and now they're under the witness protection program here in the U.S. Now, Ovidio's arrest led to a lot of violence, and you're still seeing all the byproducts of what happened back then. Describe what's been going on in Culiacan now for the better part of a year.
Yeah, it's really tragic, and it's something that hits very close to home. This is a place where I've worked for 10 years, and it's a place also where, it may not be a surprise to your average viewer, your average listener here that, oh yeah, there's, drug violence in Culiacan, Sinaloa. But I've got to tell you that this violence, and a wave of violence that started on September 9th, has claimed about 1,500 lives, more than 500 forced disappearances, and countless other acts of violence. People in Culiacan live under an informal, basically after 6 p.m., nobody goes outside. They call it the narco pandemia. It's like a return to the COVID lockdowns because people are literally afraid to be on the streets. And this is people who have grown up in a place where the Sinaloa cartel has always been present and in fact dominant in, the function of the city. And people are scared. There are soldiers on the streets. Just a week ago, there were 20 bodies found, several of them decapitated. It's just not letting up. But again, the biggest part of the tragedy, I think, is that Culiacan, right before this happened, Ovidio was extradited on July 25th, 2004, and the violence came a little later in the summer on September 9th. Just before this, if you take the period from June 2017 until June 2024, so summer to summer, Culiacan had the biggest reduction in violence, and Sinaloa the biggest reduction of violence of anywhere in Mexico. Organized crime was down more than 50%. The homicide rate was down more than 50%. There was a whole new kind of civil society contract about how to handle violence, how to deal with the victims of violence and make sure that they're attended to. The impunity rate for murder was going down. There was a restorative justice program in place. There was much better trust in government. And things were just getting better, and it all blew up on September 9th. And people in Culiacan feel just terribly forgotten in all this. You read the national newspapers, and it's all about what's going on between Mexico and the U.S. or what's going on between Trump and Sheinbaum, and they say, forget about that. What about this? Our kids can't go to school. They've been on a reduced school program. Again, it's a lot like COVID. It feels like the COVID lockdown, where people are afraid to go out and having big struggles about when is it safe to be out? When should children be in school? When should they not? So it's just a really tragic situation. And the last thing I would say about the violence, the quality of the violence has changed too. We hear a lot about this as a civil war among the Sinaloa cartel where, one group is killing members of the other group in a kind of tit for tat. But the thing I think a lot of people forget is lots of ordinary people have been pulled into that or caught in the crossfire, which is something that just didn't happen before, or not nearly on this scale anyway. We're talking about people who are being killed to have their vehicle stolen from them because the Chapitos or the Maíza, the two groups that are fighting, they need SUVs. They need vehicles to fight their war, or businesses that are being extorted for everything that they have, not in an ongoing protection racket where it's like, you better pay me every month. This is, I want everything that's in your checking account now because I need it. My boss said I have to have it because we're fighting a war. So police officers being killed for a bounty. I have a very good friend, Benjamin Villarreal, who was an amazing person, a police officer who had a PhD and was pursuing another graduate degree, was somebody who really wanted to modernize the Culiacan police force, make it a lot more like a European police force. And he resigned at the end of October because he said, look, we can't do this. The local police, we can't handle this war between these two big international groups here. There's nothing we can do. And he returned to being a regular beat cop. And he was murdered in a restaurant by a teenager who collected a bounty. Didn't even know his name, just knew that he was a police officer, collected a bounty of about $200 for murdering him. So this is the kind of stories we hear. And so I'm sorry to go on about it, but I feel like if your viewers want to take, one concrete thing away from like below the politics are important. It's that an enormous amount of suffering followed this in Culiacan.
It's incredible stuff that you're sharing with us, Ev. We're speaking with Ev Mead, the director of Proceso Pacifico, and we're going to talk continue this conversation right after the break. Stay with us. Border Report Live is back in just about a minute. And welcome back to this Friday edition of Border Report Live. I am Rudy Mideles, your host for the program, and joined by San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera and director of Proceso Pacifico, Ev Mead.
Well, Ev, you were talking about the violence in Culiacan, and President Claudia Sheinbaum, is saying, we're paying the price. We helped you catch Ovidio Guzman, but we're the ones paying the price. Now you're negotiating with somebody that you have said to be a terrorist, even though you claim you don't negotiate with terrorists. But we're taking all the hits, yet we're not getting anything in return during this plea bargain. Talk a little bit about Sheinbaum's concerns and why she is saying that Mexico's getting the short end of the bargain here.
Well, it's a difficult position for her to be in because on the one hand, some of it may be a little bit of political theater because, she's an elected official and, she's the party in power, and it's a state in her country, Sinaloa, where this violence is largely taking place. We've seen some upticks in other places like Juarez and Tijuana and Acapulco as well. But so that she's right in that sense, and I think she has to speak to that. She needs to come out. The audience may not be the United States, I guess, is my guess there. My guess is that's a domestic political audience saying, I care and I'm defending you. And she can say something like with Ovidio Guzman, she can say, look, if you negotiate this stuff down, you only charge him with those things. What about those 10 Mexican soldiers that were killed when he was arrested? Here I am. I'm their commander in chief. I represent them. I represent their families as victims. Why aren't their deaths on the table? Why isn't that part of the cost here? Again, though, I think that's playing more to the Mexican audience, because if you look at what she's done versus what she said, what she's done is taken, the 30 most important capos that were in from the drug trade in Mexico that Mexico had in custody and extradited into the United States, which no Mexican president has ever done. She's also sped up the extradition process. Ovidio, was arrested in the very beginning of January in 2023. And, by the following summer, he was in the United States. This is not what used to happen with these cases. They would drag on, if you look at the Beltran-Leyva cases and some of these, they dragged on for 10 years. So she, her actions convey that she's really, she basically supports what U.S. prosecutors are doing. She just also has to tell people in Mexico that they're suffering counts too. And if that's discounted in this prosecution, she's going to complain. So I think it's a little bit kind of playing to different audiences. And, and I think I can say that in her defense. It's the same thing she's saying kind of in the Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. case, the boxer's son who comes to the United States for this fight with Jake Paul. And then, all of a sudden he's got federal charges against him in the United States. And they're saying he's a hitman for or at least participated in violence on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel. And she says, well, let's bring him here to prosecute him. Turns out he had an arrest warrant in Mexico since 2023. And they never executed it. And he's wandering around doing public events. So it is a little bit of she's sort of stuck with the fact that it's just a fact that a lot of these things, everybody knows sort of that the person is guilty or that they're guilty of many things, many bad things, let's say, but they haven't been able to act. Mm-hmm. And she has to kind of own that now. And so she's trying to talk the talk. But yeah, it's a very difficult situation to be in. And I think, in Mexico, there are other, she's not just dealing with this. I think that's important too. The relationship with the United States has a bunch of other aspects to it. And then dealing with organized crime, it's not just the situation in Culiacan. There's also a big situation going on with the pirated gasoline. It's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in pirated gasoline. It's something that her predecessor and her mentor said was gone, that he eliminated as a problem. And it seems like it's still a pretty big problem. They did a set of arrests in the state of Nuevo León and, found hundreds of thousands, if not millions of I think it was like 15 million liters of pirated gasoline in one hit. So she's dealing with they intercepted a plane from El Salvador that had 417 kilograms of cocaine on it last week. It's a multi-layered problem within the country that she has to address, and along with persistently high levels of violence, as well as everything going on with the United States.
Let me ask you about Sheinbaum a little further. Perhaps I'm going to put you on the spot here, but she's saying we're being left out of the negotiations with Ovidio. Yeah. Is she afraid of what he might reveal He knows where the bodies are buried. Apparently, he has videotape or images of all the payouts they have ever done. Is she afraid that he might come up and stir things up for the Mexican government, her administration, as well as the one before with AMLO?
It's possible, and I'm sure that I'm not sure that she's personally afraid, because I haven't seen any evidence that I or anyone accuse her of having any personal benefit or her career having benefited from it. There are some people who are very adamant that Ovidio knows things that would be very compromising to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, her predecessor and mentor. So that's possible. But again, I think the chances of the big reveal are lower than and again, because we've sort of seen this movie before. Every time one of these guys is arrested, this happens. Yeah, there might be a little bit of fear. And they might like to being involved. They might be able to anticipate a little bit more what's going to happen. There have been cases where it looked like there was going to be a big reveal, like with one of the former ministers of defense, and it just didn't pan out that way in the end. Everything that came out of that was already kind of publicly known. So, or the General Cienfuegos, or several of the other high-profile cases. In the end, we returned him to Mexico. So, and he was exonerated. So, I think that's probably overplayed. I think that they might like to have advanced knowledge. I'm sure any head of state would want advanced knowledge if something's gonna come out. Honestly, I think their biggest liability is probably in the state of Sinaloa. And there may be a question of whether they're going to. The federal government is going to stand behind the current governor of Sinaloa, because there's a strong sense that U.S. officials are very convinced that he was a lot more involved with the cartel than they let on, and that he's lied about it. So that could be something in the pipeline. Maybe they want to know a little bit more, but I think it's mostly theater. I think it's something she feels she has to say because there's a lot of rumor.
All right. Well, we're going to continue our conversation with Ev Mead, the director of Proceso Pacifico, right after the break. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. Welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host of the program. And joining me now is San Diego correspondent Salvador Rivera and director of Proceso Pacifico, Ev Mead. And Ev, we were kind of talking a little bit about President Sheinbaum, and I know you had some questions, Sal, for Ev.
Well, yes. We're seeing historic lows in terms of immigration or migration, not just from Mexico, but from other countries, people that were coming through Mexico. What has been Sheinbaum's role in helping create this low immigration rates here between Mexico and the United States?
On the one hand, I think you can rightly claim, and they can rightly take credit for continuing AMLO's policy, which was a pretty strict immigration policy for Mexico. By the end of his administration, Mexico was detaining and deporting, really record numbers of people in all over the country. They were doing it in Mexico City. They were doing it in the south on the kind of migration routes. They were enforcing the southern border like Mexico's really never done before. On the other hand, as a social scientist, I will tell you, I would be very skeptical of giving any of the policymakers really in either country too much credit for this. We had an unprecedented wave of migration associated with COVID that and a couple of other political crises around the world. It crested, and then the demand just fell. And I think that's really largely what's happened. So I don't think it's AMLO or Sheinbaum, nor do I think it's really Biden or Trump. I think migration is really demand driven. People who pick up and cross a continent on foot aren't necessarily doing so because they've read the latest policy report out of Congress, or know who's president, or even how like an asylum process works. You could say, I think in the U.S. case, I think it is true when the Biden administration really dramatically restricted access. I'm sure that the word got down and fewer people came, but the real big drivers are social. They're not political. And the world went through a really dramatic period there with COVID that was social, economic, public health. Violence rates went up, and just as they did in the United States, all over our continent, people were displaced. And they came, but that really crested, and a lot of that pressure has abated, and people aren't coming, or the people who are coming from places where there's some very specific crisis, like from Venezuela, which is becoming kind of a failed state, or from zones in Colombia that were peaceful but have erupted in conflict again. So I really think that that's the big story. There is not any of the politicians. It's just the pressure abated. Now, the pressure abated, but we kept paying attention to it too, and we're all a little bit guilty of that. We're kind of fighting the last war.
I remember a few years ago speaking to the number 2 person in the State Department. He was here for a lecture, and he was telling me that migration as a whole over the entire world was at record numbers, something unseen in centuries, people moving around and about. And so that, I guess that would play to what you're saying. And so I know we're winding down on our show, our time allotted to today, but I did want to talk about fentanyl. You talk about immigration numbers being down. I guess fentanyl, the exportation deaths are down. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing when it comes to fentanyl.
Yeah, I mean, there's some very good news. And the good news is that the overdose deaths are down really dramatically. The difference between 2023 and 24 was 30,000 deaths fewer deaths. So, and it had been going up, just absolutely skyrocketing. If you go back to 2015, it was 9,000. It peaked to over 75,000, and we're down to about 48,000. So 48,000 is still really high. And I think anybody in the administration who says that, they're right. They're absolutely right to say that it's still really high. But it's come way down, and it came way down in 2024, and we're not sure where it is in 2025, but it looks like that trend is continuing. And the question then is, how much do the policies affect it? And I would say that they did. I think that there's been a concerted law enforcement effort to break up the fentanyl networks, to do enhanced enforcement and search and seizure at the border. That's been in place for years now. And I think law enforcement really made this a priority. They made it a priority several years ago, really independent of politics. And they made a big difference. I also think, though, that the demand side was affected. I think that, localities and states all over the United States made it a lot easier to get in the lock zone, changed the way they handle prevention programs, collaborated with things like homeless shelters and safe use sites, educated police officers. And it was a really big, kind of multi-pronged effort. And I do think the federal government of the United States bankrolled some of that under the Biden administration. You give them a little bit of credit there. But the reality is a lot of people worked on this for years outside of the political spotlight in Mexico City and Washington, and they made a real dent in it, and it seems like that's going. And what I don't want to happen is, because of political theater in Mexico or political theater in the United States, that we undermine those folks. It doesn't mean the drug problem on the border has gone away. There are other things that are booming. I mean, the market for smokable methamphetamine, for example, is everywhere. And anybody who deals with homeless or marginal populations in the United States can tell you that it's super cheap, it's super potent, and it's everywhere. So it's not that a drug problem has gone away, but the particular problem of fentanyl appears to have crested, and hopefully we can hold the line on that and not let any politics, right or left, get in the way of that progress.
Okay. Thank you, Webb. As we wind down, I did want to explain a portion of video that we saw. There was a video that we were given or provided by the Drug Enforcement Agency. You see a gentleman who falls over and a girl's lying down in a parking lot. They thought they were taking cocaine, which is not good for you either. But the stuff was laced with fentanyl. The gentleman who collapsed, he died. The girl survived. But it's tragic. We've heard of the stories many, many times over. Rudy, as we're winding down our time here with Eb, do you have any questions or anything you want to add? I know I sort of dominated the conversation with Eb. Is there something you want to ask Eb about the border or things that might happening, trends here that we're seeing?
Yeah, actually, what are, one of the things we're seeing down here in South Texas is a lot of ICE raids happening. Have you seen anything like that happening on kind of either side of the border when it comes to migrants?
Yeah, I think definitely. There have been some indictments for lower level traffickers affiliated with the Sinaloa cartel. So yes, the trick is that the way that these are announced, the way that the word's coming out, it's very hard to know which ones actually have to do with fentanyl or drug trafficking and which are just immigration enforcement. my sense is that the immigration enforcement stuff far outnumbers the others. And that's not necessarily because that's the preference of the federal government, but I think it's actually because they've been so successful at breaking up a bunch of the local networks that most of the known ones they've already gone after. So I think that they're left with kind of low-hanging fruit. And as we all know, there's a whole separate phenomenon going on where they're targeting anybody who doesn't, have immigration status or who has a status that's been revoked by the administration. So I think it's really a separate phenomenon. But yeah, I mean, there have been these multi-agency raids on fentanyl, and it again goes back a couple of years, but those have continued.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. That was Ev Mead, director of Proceso Pacifico. And thank you, Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent. And before we go, just a reminder, don't forget to check your local Nexstar stations lineup for our Political Power Ranker show. It's right there, streaming now. This week, host Chris Berg and Emerson College polling director examine who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on data, so make sure to check it out. And don't forget to check out borderreport.com as well. You can find the stories that Sal, Sandra, Julian, our team of incredibly award-winning and talented border journalists are working on, borderreport.com. My name is Rudy Mireles from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. Have a great day.
Good.